So welcome to the webinar. How do we talk about climate change at a time like this? It's a big question. We held a webinar last week and we spoke, a lot of people raised that question. I'll introduce myself. My name is Anya O'Gorman and I work with the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition, and I've been working on the One Future campaign for the last while. And what we're going to talk about today is we've been running a campaign and we've been talking about, before the coronavirus crisis, we were talking about how going out and talking to your TDs and asking them to prioritise climate in the next programme for government. And then, as we all know, the coronavirus hit. And then, so what we've been talking about is how can we continue talking about this other big crisis that all of us know is so important and threatening in this time where our frontline workers, people across the country are being forced to really think about the most vulnerable in society, and we're really trying to work together to fight this current very immediate threat. So before we start, I just wanted to maybe just take a moment of quiet to just acknowledge that people might be feeling a bit scared, there might be a bit of grief, there might be a bit of anxiety, there might be a bit of stress. And to acknowledge that and to hold it for a second, and then I'll tell you what's going to happen in the rest of the call. So I'm just going to give just 1 minute just for that. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. It's really incredible. There's over 80 people, almost 90 people on this call, which really shows that a lot of people are really feeling confused and passionate about this issue. So what are we going to do today? We are going to talk a little bit, first of all, about what's the current context we're looking at. So we're currently looking at Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael having negotiations and talks around a new government and a new programme for government. And what does that mean for us in this current time? Then what we're going to do is we're going to hear from a few different panelists. So we're going to hear from Sandra from Irish Doctors for the Environment about her experience about Irish Doctors for the Environment and about some of the links between health and climate, and talking about advocating for climate during a health emergency. Then we're going to hear from Cliona Sharkey from Trócaire, who's going to talk to us about, Cliona does a lot of policy and lobbying and talking about how to really talk to your TD if you're going to talk to them about climate in a compassionate way at this time. And then finally, we're going to hear from Saibh O'Neill, who's the policy coordinator with Stop Climate Chaos, around some of the narratives and frames for talking about climate in this time. And one of the things to say is we, in the last, as I'm sure lots of the rest of you, have been working really hard to understand and build our narratives around this in a really compassionate way. And we've been talking to partners across the world, across Europe, to think about how do we do that. So we're not, everything isn't perfect yet. Things may change, as I'm sure you all know. But we really want to have this discussion and have this honest discussion, because in this time of physical distancing, being social together and learning from each other and talking to each other is so important. So after everyone speaks, you will have a time for asking questions. So yeah, so we're going to kick off, and Oisín's just going to give us a little talk through about there's a lot of words being thrown around at the moment, programme for government, different things. So Oisín, can you give us a quick run through about what exactly does that mean, and what exactly does that mean for people who care both about the climate and about the health crisis that we see ourselves in?
Sure, thanks, Anya. And it's really great to be here this evening and to see so many people on a Sunday evening join us to grapple with this. This came out of our last webinar last week about how to build community in a disrupted world, that we were all struggling to know how do we, who've been seeing a crisis in climate change over the last 10 years and wanting it to be treated as an emergency, how do we now, and the election was supposed to be about that and was a little bit, how do we react now when our leaders are responding to another really existential threat, and with the risk that our one will get pushed to one side? How do we talk about that appropriately and effectively? And we don't have all the answers, which is why it's great to be figuring this out collectively together. And as Anya said, we are learning where we can from other people around the world with the same challenges. And I've certainly been back and forth on whether or not we can be talking to TDs and ringing them up and trying to meet them on Zoom like we had planned once we couldn't meet them in person. And I think one of the reasons that we can do that is because they now look like they are getting serious about having programme for government negotiations, government formation negotiations between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. If they were abandoning that and only having a national government to do coronavirus, and as the death toll rises, it may get more difficult to talk about anything else other than that. But if they're negotiating a programme for government, which is basically what policies and strategies is the government going to pursue over the next 5 years, if they're doing that, well, then it's perfectly legitimate for citizens to be in touch with TDs who we've elected, and indeed with parties, to say, look, obviously I know right now all you can do is Corona, but if you're actually sitting down to write a 5-year plan for government, you've got to have climate at the heart of that as well. There's going to be a big economic package to deal with the coronavirus fallout. That's got to have climate at the heart of it, and emissions reduction at the heart of it, and not be like the recession 10 years ago, which was basically back to pollution, back to business as usual as soon as possible. So in that context of what looks like to be beginning to be serious negotiations between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, it's certainly our right, and indeed possibly not quite our duty, but our impetus as campaigners and those who care about climate change to re-engage with our political representatives now appropriately, which is why I look forward to hearing from others as to how best we do that.
Super. Thank you so much, Oisin. People are, no one's asking any questions yet. If you have questions straight away, sorry, I'm getting notifications. If you have questions straight away for your panelists and you want to put them in the chat box, I'll try and filter through a few and ask a few to our panelists. However, if you have big questions, we'll have time for you to ask big questions at the end. So decide. We won't have time for everyone's questions. So if you want me to ask a couple of questions as we go, then yeah. Thank you from Art for giving Oisin the words that he wants to say. It's our responsibility. So first of all, do we put our questions in Q&A or in the chat box? Please put them in the chat box. Thank you. So first of all, I'm going to go to Sandra. So Sandra is a doctor with Irish Doctors for the Environment, and Sandra's just going to give us, unfortunately, the video isn't working for Sandra or Keena or other, no, this is my fault. But Sandra's just going to have a chat with us. Basically, we're trying to keep this as informal and discursive as possible. So yeah, we're just gonna have a chat with Sandra and see, yeah, tell us what have Irish Doctors for the Environment been thinking about and talking about in the last few days.
Thanks a million for having me on. I'm kind of glad that there's no video because I've just come home from a day of work, so I'm relieved. But we had to have a similar question with ourselves in Irish Doctors Environment about whether or not we should be talking about this right now, and what it kind of came down to for us was that we felt manpower wise we probably didn't really have the capacity at the minute to be dealing with what we're dealing with in work, and then also to be advocating on this. So for the moment we've put a pause on things from Irish Doctors for the Environment, but we have still probably what we've been discussing mostly is really COVID to date, and in the hospitals, obviously, you know, there's quite a bit of stress at the minute with people trying to get prepared and trying to get ready and trying to anticipate how things will be, and hearing stories from Italy about what we might have to expect, as well as people possibly having to take on new roles. So, but mostly what we are feeling in the hospitals and amongst our group in Irish Doctors Environment is kind of a sense of collegiality and people trying to support each other. And so far in the hospitals, I myself have been pretty impressed about how we are getting prepared. So hopefully we will manage. But so from our side, we've decided to try and we haven't really been doing much work from Irish Doctors Environment, but that doesn't say that we don't think it's still extremely important work to be being done. And that's kind of why I decided to come on the call today, because we still think it's extremely important that it is done. I think, you know, we can learn a lot from the COVID that you can apply to what's going on in terms of climate change. Like within the hospitals, sort of some of the anxiousness comes from a kind of sense of nearly that, you know, we don't have quite control over how things can go. Like we can get prepared in the hospital, but you know, how things will go depends on whether or not the public will comply with social distancing and will comply with the behaviour changes that have been laid out for them. And that will depend on whether or not our health systems get overrun. And that seems to be looking at what's happening in other parts of the world, what decides on the mortality rate. And a lot of things from that can be drawn across to actions that you take with climate change. So, you know, you need people to comply with behaviour change in order for there to be effect that would prevent mortality. What we talk about a lot in Irish Doctors Environment, which is a group of healthcare professionals made up of doctors and other allied healthcare professions, we often are always trying to talk about the links between climate change and health. And to do that, we go out and we have talks, and we arrange talks as well. And some of the things that we've noted with in line with the COVID outbreak is that some of the factors that would have exacerbated this problem, like you know, kind of mass globalization and people moving around so frequently in the world, are similar problems that would contribute to the climate crisis as well. So I think you can kind of draw on those things too. But obviously, you know, we have in front of us a very obvious and real threat in front of us to health, but we still in the background have the threat to our health in terms of the climate crisis, which is another health crisis. And we still know that even in light of COVID, which is a very real problem in front of you, still the greatest global health threat of our time will be climate change. And still, you know, 250,000 deaths a year will happen, much far greater than what will happen from COVID every year from climate change. And we know that there'll be 9 million deaths from pollution as well. So, you know, these other problems that are there will have a much more significant impact on health than the COVID response. And I think, you know, you can talk about it in terms of, yes, this is a very very important time for us to protect our health, but there is still an even greater risk out there. And if looking at the response of what we've done in terms of COVID, it's this kind of response and this kind of action that we need to see in order to address climate change as well. And I think I'm so glad you brought up the vulnerable groups, because in the same way, you know, we need to protect our vulnerable groups in society, and that's what we do as a society, you know, protecting the elderly and protecting those who might have other illnesses. In the same way, we need to be thinking about those groups in terms of how climate change will be affecting them as well. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I can't hear you, Anya.
Thank you so much, Sandra, and thanks for all that you're doing. It's really inspiring to see everything that you guys are doing, and thanks for really drawing those links so clearly between the health crisis we're seeing now and the climate crisis. So I'm going to go now to Cliona Sharkey, and Cliona Sharkey works for Chokra, and Cliona works a lot lobbying politicians. So Cliona is just going to talk us through the practicalities of how do you talk to politicians, how do we approach when we're approaching politicians at this time, how can we do that in a compassionate way? And some of the links that she sees between climate and COVID.
Thanks, Sonia. I assume you can hear me, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So hi everyone, thanks so much for being here, and it's great to be connected with everybody. Apologies, my video isn't working. So I think Oisín outlined already why this is a very legitimate time to be contacting our TDs about this issue. And I think it's interesting, as Anya said, we're very lucky to be receiving information from colleagues in other countries who are looking at how the debate, the media, the public debate is evolving in other countries. And from that we can see that, you know, while there is and continues to be this intense focus on the moment by moment evolution of the situation, there is relatively quickly a space begins to open up for more and further reflection on the broader issues that connect with the issue itself and things like that. So that is something they're witnessing in other countries, so we can anticipate that here too. And I think already, I'm sure some of you are seeing in the news here, we won't be the first people to mention climate change and the environment. It's out there in the media debate already, so it shouldn't be too much of a surprise for a politician to hear you making a connection. I suppose I'm going to try and keep quite practical, and I think the plan is to say something after the call in the next day or two, with some of these issues outlined. So don't worry too much about writing this down. This will come to you afterwards. So I'm just going to go through some practicalities about reaching out to your TD. So I suppose we can't anticipate what each TD, where they're at personally, practically, what's going on for them, and indeed their attitudes as regards the situation and climate change. So do reach out, feel free to reach out to try and set up a call or a virtual meeting. And if you find that they're not getting back to you, use your judgment, wait a week and try again. So you're perfectly entitled to be reaching out, but just there's, I suppose, no need to be too forceful if you're not getting an immediate response. And then the second thing I would say is to remember that sometimes we forget, but TDs are humans too. So they will be experiencing many of the same practical challenges and also mental and emotional challenges that we're all facing. So when you do manage to connect with them, or even when you're reaching out to them to try and set something out, do address them as humans first, and that are going through this crisis. So you don't have to ask them about their personal situation. That's probably not appropriate, but you can say that you hope that they and their family are all safe and well. And I think and recognizing what's happening in your own community, and particularly if there are very positive things that you can see happening in your own community to respond to the crisis. And then an important thing in any situation, I suppose, when you're reaching out to a TD or speaking to them, is to do a little bit of work beforehand. So read up a bit on who you're speaking to. Congratulate them on whether it's their first election or their re-election, acknowledging that it's a challenging situation for governance. You can find out what they or their party have done in the last few years on climate change, and thank them for any positive things they've done. That's going to set you up on the right foot for the discussion. And if you don't have this information or can't find it, you can contact Stop Climate Chaos, and someone will help you out with that. And then as regards kind of making the connection, I suppose you ease into this discussion as you would in any situation, but particularly in the current context. So I think what we don't want to do is to in any way try to suggest that climate change is more important than what's happening right now. Start by acknowledging the scale and seriousness of the COVID crisis and the importance of containing it and supporting those in crisis. And I think you could, I suppose, welcome, as I said, the positive response, the outpouring of goodwill to try and support the most vulnerable, and the kind of debate that we're seeing around greater solidarity in policy, and that focus on the most vulnerable people. And then in terms of moving to the climate change issue specifically.
Lena, I think we've lost you.
Can you hear me?
I can hear.
Yeah, I think it's maybe just Anya that's missed me. I'm going to keep going anyway.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Tell me, Oisin. So I suppose the most important thing is that to be authentic, you need to talk about climate change. You're going to talk about it in the way that is in the words and the way that's most authentic for you. So these are just some ideas. So that you could say how the crisis has deepened your concern around climate change, because it so shows in such stark terms how fragile our societies are to systemic shocks and how interconnected we are globally. And I think some of the things that Sandra said really demonstrate that as well. And then I think really important in terms of making the connection then with the current political context and the link to, as Oisin said, the programme for government, is that we didn't know this crisis was coming. We didn't know this was going to come so quickly and hit so hard. but we do know climate change is already here, and we know without a shadow of a doubt the catastrophic impacts on entire societies, economies, and ecosystems are coming unless we dramatically reduce emissions. Climate change is another massive but foreseeable global risk, and we can see now the importance of early action, both from from governments, and as Sandra said, the encouraging and supporting the population to engage and to protect the most vulnerable. And I think some of the positive things we can point to as well is that like we've seen governments rallying around the science and listening to what the experts say need to be done. And that's something that we want to see on climate change as well. Importantly then, taking the example, as Oisín said, we have seen in terms of the measures that are going to be needed to get people back to health, to get people back to work, to get the economy moving again, is going to take a huge swathe of both policy measures and economic measures. And what we cannot do is make the same mistake we did after 2008 and put us back into an economy and a society that simply are putting us in a position for further significant disruption down the line. So like it's understandable that climate change may not be at the top of people's priority list right now, but if it's not central to the recovery, we'll be knowingly making the same mistake again and inviting further disruption down the line. Another couple of practical things you could do is to highlight, you might be speaking yourself or you might be speaking with a group of other people, but one way or another you could highlight the number of people you're connected with in your community that care about this. So if they know you're more than one person or more than two people, this has even more impact because they realize there's a number of there are people, there are voters essentially in their community that are caring about these issues. Another thing you can do is that in case they're not reading the news and seeing the connections with climate and environment, is to highlight that it's not just you and people who care about climate change who are pointing to this issue. Anya sent a few great quotes in the email she sent out about things that Mary Robinson has been saying, about the head of the International Energy Agency saying that the recovery has to have climate at the centre, or we're making a huge mistake at our own risk. And then finally, I would say just to use your judgment. This is about building a relationship with these TDs for further communication down the line. So if the TD is engaged in the conversation, you know, continue on, build a relationship, get your points across. If they're short with you, or if they really do want to engage on this issue, get in as much as you can without feeling overly aggressive or pushy or anything like that. What you don't want to do is to turn them off for the long term. So regardless how the call goes, thank them for their time and say that you're going to look forward to continuing to be in touch with them on this, so they know you're going to be coming back. And we'll leave it. I leave it to Saib and Oisín to speak more about specifics of what we can be asking for. There are also maybe there's some really good advice coming from colleagues overseas as well about things to avoid in terms of communications, both public communications and engagement with decision makers on these issues. So these will be also in the document that Anya is going to send around. I won't go into all of them now. I'll just mention one or two. And one is to avoid hyping or sensationalizing the links between COVID and climate change, because this could end up doing more damage down the line. I think the parallels, if you like, are there in terms, the analogies are there, and they are enough to be able to talk about climate change. And I think the other thing then I would just say is to avoid anything that makes it sound like you're trying to say climate change is more important, or that because it's not going to land well for very obvious reasons, and they need to be sensitive that this really is at the top of everyone's mind and priorities for very valid reasons at the moment. So as I said, it's I'll hand over to Saib and Oisín to go on to the next, and happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Cliona. That was great. I'm just going to invite, now we've been sitting for half an hour, so I'm just going to invite everyone, and also you're staring at a black screen sometimes. So everyone, if you just want to do like a little stretch in your chair for a second, how she's going to do it with me. I don't know whoever else is doing it with me. I feel a bit silly, but hopefully you can give me just a little bit of time. So there's lots of stuff happening in the chat box, and that is great. There's a lot of people talking about the links between climate change and the COVID crisis. One of the things that we're saying about the links, nothing is clear yet, because as we know, the COVID crisis is moving so rapidly and has come upon us so fast. So one of the clear things that we're saying about those links is, as Clean has said, and as most of our colleagues worldwide are saying, we're trying not to too much emphasize loads and loads of links between them, and we're just trying to say there's experts on both sides, and the experts around corona have been listened to by governments, and we should listen to experts on climate. So unite behind the science, as Greta Thunberg says. So I'm going to just pass on to Sive, and a couple of questions have come through. One is about the speed of mobilization is impressive. How can this be applied from the doctors, and how can this be applied to learnings for climate change? And then a question from Shay asking about how can we stop this becoming a money issue, that there's no money for our climate targets. I'm not expecting you to answer those questions straight away, Sive, but they might be something to frame some of your thoughts as well as you go through, and we'll answer those questions at the end as well. So yeah, Sive, if you want to take it away.
Can you hear me, or do I need to unmute myself?
We can hear you.
You can hear me. Okay, great. So just to say that I'm working at the moment with Stop Climate Chaos on policy stuff, and I was involved with the One Future campaign as well, and did a few things around that. But my background is actually in environmental philosophy. So in the context of trying to get my head around what's been happening with the pandemic, you know, it's brought me back into thinking about ecology and systems theory. So I have a few comments just to make, because it's actually the kind of material that's been coming up in the chat with the questions. But I don't want you to take anything that I'm saying here as sort of the gospel as to how to approach TDs. I strongly recommend that you follow the suggestions that Cliona has just given. But in terms of understanding what's going on, I do think it's very important that we do take a step back and kind of try to comprehend what's actually going on here. So at a local, regional, national level, we have a public health crisis. But there's no doubt about it, but that there is an ecological dimension to this, and that pandemics are one of a series of potential and very real systemic risks that we all face in modern civilization, partly as a result of the speed of transmission that is now possible due to globalization and air travel and so on. So both a virus can start out in one part of the world and arrive within 2 weeks on the other side of the world, but also the economic impacts can travel quickly as well. And we call that a kind of supply chain contagion, the effect on financial system, the effect on supply chains, the disruption to business in one part of the world that can travel throughout technology and systems. So the ecological aspect can't be isolated from the socio-ecological, socio-economic impacts. And that's true of many systemic risks. It's particularly true of this pandemic because of the shock effect it's had in economic terms. But one of the things that I have come across that I think is important to say, and we don't have to get into the forensic pathological detail of it, but that disease is an environmental issue. And it's not just an environmental issue in terms of how it affects people disproportionately who are more vulnerable and who are already weakened by pollution and other disadvantages and inequalities, but the origins of disease as well has its roots in the destruction of biodiversity and wilderness. And of course, the planet has been suffering unprecedented biodiversity loss and destruction in the last 100 years, which has only been accelerating in the last 50 years. I came across one statistic that the global trade, I think, has quintupled in the last 5 decades. So we can talk about the proximate causes of a virus, a bat dropping, contaminated, or, fruit dropping, so whatever that's picked up by a pig or a bird or a human. And that's, for people to figure out and understand. But we also have another set of causes which we would maybe describe as drivers, the context in which human beings are living and encroaching on wild spaces in many parts of the world, bringing us into closer contact with animals. And most of the infectious diseases that have appeared in the last few decades have been are zoonotic diseases. They're kind of transmitted from animals to humans. So then on top of these drivers, globalization, and the destruction of wilderness and biodiversity and loss of complexity in ecosystems. So the loss of resilience in ecosystems to bounce back from different kinds of stresses. And that includes us as well. We also have threat multipliers. So climate change, if you like, is the ultimate threat multiplier in that if, for example, God forbid, in these dreadful times with all of the stresses and the effect of illness on a population, there was to be some kind of terrible climatic or extreme weather event on top of that. So you can imagine how causality in this sense can go in both directions, that climate change can drive the weakening of ecosystems, and the weaker ecosystems can accelerate climate change, and you have a mix of variables thrown together. So it's very hard to disentangle one thing from another. So that's ecology for you. We are living on a planet that is subject to biophysical constraints. We have been living beyond our means. We have been putting ecosystems under enormous strain, not just in tropical places where these exotic diseases might be coming from, but here in Ireland as well. And that erosion and whittling away of nature, wild places, and of biodiversity loss means that we're losing reservoirs of complexity, of ecosystem diversity that is essential for maintaining ecosystem health and our health. That's the loss of natural capital, if you like. So in terms of how we need to think about this, we don't need to get into that in detail when we're talking to politicians. But I know from the chat that's been coming up there, that that's a kind of a concern of people, that we instinctively do want to join the dots. We want to make connections because we feel intuitively that they're there. And I want to confirm that they are there. The obvious response is that we need to accelerate our efforts to protect biodiversity. And that includes, and I like this phrase because it captures the human dimension, I think, and pandemic really well. We also need to protect our epidemiological environment. We need to cushion ourselves against these potentially fatal infectious diseases. And we do that by building resilience in nature and in human systems. The other thing we need to do is, as Greta Thunberg says it so beautifully, we need to treat the crisis like it's a crisis. And here we have a classic example, and people asked the questions about the mobilization. Only a state could intervene as quickly and as powerfully and in a coordinated fashion. So no private organization, and like if it was left to us as individuals to figure all these social distancing rules out for ourselves, or to shut up shop on a voluntary basis, you can imagine how chaotic that would be. But that's actually how climate policy is being executed. Whereas in the case of this crisis, we can see how the power of the state is being deployed highly effectively to coordinate and centralize and communicate action. It's resourcing the things that need to be done. It's mobilizing the right people in the right places. It's bringing the resources to the right places at the right time. And it's acting with great speed. But there's no question about the fact that this is clearly an emergency. You wouldn't have to do it quite that fast, one hopes, in a climate emergency. But that's the kind of coordination of policy and decision making that we need to see the state doing in order to act effectively on climate change. So instead of having these siloed government departments that don't talk to each other, one policy that's pushing up emissions while another policy is trying to reduce it, we would have coordinated, joined up thinking and the resources to match it. And so our One Future demands, for example, we've pointed to the fact that we need to see a complete switch in the priority given to public transport over road-based transport in the way resources are allocated. So that's the kind of example of where you have joined up thinking. You don't say you're going to reduce emissions from transport and then build lots of new roads or invest all of your limited resources in road policies. So definitely the power of the state. And the other aspect of the state and its power is clearly visible in the way that it's deployed financial resources to shore up the economy as it, you know, heads into this terrible zombie-like state with nothing, no activity happening and no transactions, and the build-up of potential debt and loss of income. So what environmental groups across Europe are kind of focusing on there is to ensure that any bailouts that are agreed have green strings attached, that no money is put into propping up ailing industries that are actually going to cost money and create environmental problems into the future. So at the moment, the Irish state is investing €300 million a week into its income supports, but it's not clear how long that is going to be able to last. So there is talk about an extra budget, there is loosening of the EC purse strings, so it is possible for the state to borrow money to sustain its intervention in the crisis over the coming year. And while this isn't a core activity of Stop Climate Chaos, it's clearly going to become very relevant in the sense of how do we deploy limited public resources most effectively so that we can scale up our climate action and at the same time support people who have lost their jobs so suddenly and dramatically. And, you know, that may involve, you know, letting go of some industries. It might involve the state buying up assets, buying equity in companies to keep them afloat, with a view to getting a return on that over the long term. But we should be looking to see the state exercise this unique role that only the state can deploy because of the low cost of interest at the moment. Money is cheap for the government, but it needs to do that in a way that's consistent with our commitments under the Paris Agreement, and that is going to make the best possible use of the money so that we can invest in green infrastructure. And if I might just say a couple of final words, if you don't mind, Anya, just about the other dimension to this, which is the kind of psychological and social dimensions to the crisis. And there's no doubt about it that countries with governments that are perceived to be acting effectively and in accordance with scientific advice are those that are likely to get the most community support in terms of adherence to the physical distancing and all the other constraints that we have voluntarily undertaken. So trust will be very important, and so that's a reciprocal arrangement between citizens and the government. If the government is seen to be acting in the public interest, the public will probably follow suit by acting in that civic spirit. But at the same time, we've seen what seems to me like a flourishing of community and civic spirit and a sense of solidarity. It's hard for me to tell because I'm kind of isolated in my own little community, but the fine weather has brought people outside. There's a lot more people walking and cycling, a lot less traffic. So we're actually seeing a tiny little glimpse of what a society that's less frantic and less about commuting to jobs and more about being present might actually look like. That's not to say I've no idea what's going on in people's homes and their hearts and their minds, and if they're unwell, obviously that's a disaster. But certainly, there's been such a turnaround that it's interesting to reflect on that and to learn from that what we can about building new social networks that are more localized and not just, based on interests and the kind of orientations we have towards jobs and hobbies and things like that. And finally, just to say that don't feel that you can't get into this kind of discussion. These are really big philosophical questions, and I think it's important that we find a space to discuss the fact that our planet is in crisis and that human beings are contributing to this and making it worse. Our economic systems are making it worse, and they're also making us vulnerable in lots of different ways. And this is one example, might not have been avoidable, but many other examples of systemic risks that we might encounter in the future are avoidable. And we need to direct our psychological resources into truth telling as much as anything else, and being able to kind of share our experiences that are real, and not have elephants sitting in the corner that we can't talk about, such as climate change, or indeed any of the other systemic risks that we might be worried about. So there's lots of really nice resources available on that, and there's wonderful literature in the ecological movement going back 50, 60 years. There's plenty of it there. It's a very rich tradition, and I would encourage everyone to dive into it and take heart. So thanks, Anya.
Thanks so much, Sive. Well, I've really learned a lot, and I've been talking to most of these people for the last couple of days. So, and it seems like a lot of people are responding well. People are saying we want to continue to have these conversations, and we definitely will continue to have these conversations over the next few weeks. So there's a couple of questions that have come up, and I'm also going to ask people if they want to. We don't have a huge amount of time, but if people want to raise their hand, and then I'll put you in the queue to ask questions. Yeah, so there is a recording of the call will be available. Yeah, so I'll send around a recording of the call. So yeah, so the question, the money question is there. What will people? How do we respond to that if they say there's not enough money? People are asking about communications for peers. How do we talk about climate to our peers at this time? Hopefully we'll cover a lot of that in the document that we send around, or at least the narratives that we can use. And I think a lot of the narratives, as Cliona said, when you're talking to a TD, yes, they are elected representatives, but there are a lot of similar narratives when we talk to TDs and talk to our friends. Empathy, someone's asking about empathy in a narrative. Yeah, it's really important, especially around this time, that we have a lot of empathy for how people are feeling, for how they might be expressing themselves, and really taking a step back and having empathy for what people are saying and how they're saying it. Someone's asking, I think this is specifically for Sive, around European, let me get the question up, about the European regional level and what's happening there. We have actually, one of our team is working from The Hague at the moment, so she would be a better place to answer this question. But I don't know, Sive, do you have any comment on the European level processes around the recovery? I know you don't like using the word recovery.
Well, firstly, just to say that to the best of our knowledge, the European processes that are churning out some very important policy initiatives are still working away in the background. And this is one of the things that we're going to be keeping a very close eye on. So just because we're all stuck at home, we're not able to go to work or go out as usual, doesn't mean that the European Commission isn't still working on its Green Deal policy. They've published a draft climate law, and the intention is to consider a possible revision of the EU target for 2030 at the next Environment Council meeting. So I'm not sure if this directly answers the question, but definitely the European processes are still going on. Not everything grinds to a halt, and we have to be careful not to kind of lose sight of the fact that some policy processes will continue in the background, even while all the media attention is focused on the pandemic.
Got another question coming in about what can young people, example secondary and university students, to help with the climate emergency. I might answer this one because and I'll hand it out to the rest of the panel as well. I would say, especially for young people, if you're not in university, your first port of call is to get in touch with Fridays for Future, Schools Climate Action Network. They are actually doing some really interesting digital online campaigning, where they're using the fact that they can't go and strike on the streets anymore to do digital campaigns every Friday that are very, very targeted. So last week, they were calling out the fact that fossil fuel companies get a place at UN climate meetings. So they did a huge campaign, worldwide campaign about that last Friday. So the first thing I would do is say, get in touch with your local or Fridays for Future Ireland or Schools Climate Action Network. And university students, I think, like, if you're over 18, talk to your classmates, talk to your peers, see if you can contact your TDs yourself at this time. See if you can build groups in your university. Obviously right now that's not something you can do, but you can definitely be contacting your university or your local TDs and getting into contact with others in your area. And also I would say a big thing is amplify what the school strikers are doing. That would be, and other campaigns that are going on. Let's see what else. Does anyone have their hand up? No one has their hand up. Does anyone have a question for Sive or Sandra or Cleena or Oisin? Do the panel, in discussing with political parties, do the panel believe TGs, the general public, care about the environment or climate? Would they think the public would accept a change in lifestyle if it fixed the climate issue? Or are they thinking more about being re-elected? Oisin's going to answer that.
Hi. I mean, I think the short answer is yes, that the public do care about it, from the evidence we have, and we have some evidence that politicians know that, and politicians want to be re-elected. Politicians are humans and do care about these things too, but they are absolutely driven by their incentive structure. Encourages them to respond to what their own voters in their own constituency say, as well as what opinion polling may say. We think there was some misrepresentation of the opinion polls during a misinterpretation of the opinion polls during the election. In all of those opinion polls, climate came out as the third or fourth most important issue for people. But depending how the question was asked, it was interpreted as differently. So when people were asked, as they were by the Irish Times and in the exit poll, to name one issue, just the one issue that was most important to them, climate didn't get a very high percentage, not surprisingly. Health and housing came very high, and climate and the economy and tax and jobs and crime all came down at about 6%. But if you'd asked me 4 or 5 years ago, would I settle for when climate was deemed as important as the economy, jobs, tax and crime, I would have said yes. But health and housing were way ahead. However, when the question was put the other way, a different way, which is, can you, on a number of issues, would this issue influence your vote? Well, then 27% of people said climate was going to influence their vote. So that's a positive outcome and much higher than it would have been before. It's a lot higher, for example, than the 7% of people, I think, who voted for the Green Party. So another 20% of people said it was going to influence their vote. And again, our evidence, particularly from the previous elections last May, the European and local elections, was that politicians for the first time came back saying, oh my goodness, climate was a big issue on the doorsteps. And that's a real sign for politicians. Politicians get out and knock on doors. And that's what we tried to do with the One Future campaign this time, was to get people on the doorsteps to raise climate with their politicians and put the stickers in the windows. And we think it did. We think it did. There was an appetite out there for people to raise the issues. So if we weren't in this immediate crisis, we think that, for example, a few weeks ago, before Corona struck, Fianna Fáil were saying they wanted to go into government formation negotiations, and their top 3 priorities were health, housing, and climate change. And for Fianna Fáil to be saying that, that's a progress, given that they are a very mainstream party, a very catch-all party that absolutely hones its message to appeal to the largest group of society, not to niche audiences.
Sorry, can I chime in there as well, just to say, that if anything, this crisis has shown us what we really care about is our health, and the lengths we're going to now with staying at home and with our economy and things and we're doing all this to try and protect our health, that we've really shown how important that is. And the climate crisis is a health crisis in the very same way. And if we've shown now how important our health is to us, I think it gives us huge grounds to really raise the bar on the climate crisis as well, as another example of a health crisis.
Thanks so much, Sandra. Anyone else want to come in on that? There's one more question which I think really, there's one person who has their hand raised, and so I'm going to do one more question from the chat box, and then I'm going to come to Fergal who has his hand raised, and then we're going to start to wrap up. So there's a question here about when the corona crisis abates, the political discussion will be about how we recover. And Si's touched a bit on this, but maybe we can go a little bit more in depth into it. How do we get back to doing the stuff we did before the crisis? Are we going to have flying private cars, unlimited consumption, working like crazy in offices and factories? We're seeing the government accept the idea of a basic wage for everyone. They will want to abandon this as soon as possible. They may. We have got to steer the conversation away from all that. This business as usual stuff is not something we want to go back to. So the first thing I'm going to respond to on that is someone posted in the chat already today that a large group of NGOs across the world have participated, including some of the organizations here, wrote an open letter, signed an open letter talking about a just recovery, and there's 4 principles for a just recovery, and that's worth looking up. So if you go to 350.org/just recovery, that's one thing. So a lot of people are starting to really have those conversations about how do we make sure that how we recover and the bailout and whatever that looks like does not go back to business as usual and puts people and planet at the center. But I don't know if anyone else from the panel wants to respond to that question.
I might just say something about the fiscal response. One of the lessons that we learned from the 2008 crash, well, some of us learned it. I don't know if people in the Department of Finance learned it, but is that there is a very strong case for immediate and rapid intervention in terms of re-liquefying the economy, in terms of giving people money, because it's the cash transactions that keep businesses and jobs going and can ensure that debts are paid, essentially. So if the liquidity is taken out of domestic consumption, then that has a knock-on effect on the whole economy, and it also has a knock-on effect on banks. And at the back, at the back of all of this, the kind of systems that hold our modern capitalist economies together, for better or for worse, are essentially banking and financial systems. So we have to think about ways in which these can be somehow stabilized, but not in the manner that has been justified in the past. Stabilized in terms of providing them with the capital and liquidity that they need in order to function, to provide businesses with the resources that they can get going again after a few months of not being in action. And this is a difficult one for us because we don't, as environmentalists, tend to engage at that level of kind of economic analysis. But all of this crisis is on the one hand, it's an opportunity, because you can then say, well, look, is this the right way to invest resources? Should we be investing more in businesses that are going to generate a long-term benefit and return to the state, like renewable energy, regenerative agricultural systems, and kind of use it as an opportunity to kind of let our sort of potentially stranded assets strand themselves, although that would have enormous implications for jobs. And the other thing is we just need a level of oversight into these things. So we need to be watching what's happening here, because the bigger businesses, and especially the airline industry, is looking for massive bailouts because they're very financially precarious in a number of cases, and will go completely to the wall unless they are given a bailout of some sort. So if that is justified, what are the grounds that will be used to justify those interventions? I mean, you know, the businesses will say that they provide essential public goods, but we might need to think about what an essential public good is, you know, and we might need to think about how the businesses that are popped up are going to repay that debt. And that might involve something like an aviation tax. It might involve extra charges on short-haul flights and things like that. So there are options here for policy interventions that absolutely didn't exist a few months ago, frankly. And if we play our cards right and use our influence wisely, we might be able to get the public on board with us as well, because I'm conscious of that question that came up about, you know, would there be public backing for these kind of interventions by us, or would we get people's backs up? So we have to always navigate that kind of territory carefully. But hopefully, when we see the improved air quality, the potential for emissions reductions, people might see you know, ways around this kind of false dichotomy of its economy or nature.
Sandra, did you want to come in there? No? Okay. So we're running a little bit close to time, so I'm just going to have one chance for one more question, and Fergal has had his hand up for a while now and hands up first. I'm just going to allow Fergal to talk. Fergal, you should be able to talk now. Let's see. Oh, yeah. Fergal?
Well, could I just say, I thought there were great contributions, and I, by and large, agreed with the analysis put forward by all of the contributors. Just looking at the position we find ourselves in now, I think really we had a relatively good election in that we definitely ended up with more TDs with a better position on climate than we had in the last Dáil. Unfortunately, it looks as if we may be heading towards a new government in which those with the least advanced position end up governing us for the next 5 years. And I'm just wondering, without being directly party political, if people feel there is merit in trying to encourage those politicians who have been elected and who have good positions on climate to try and form an alliance, say around the Greens, so that they would pack some clout within a new government. It looks as if the Greens are very reluctant to go in on their own without any kind of mudguard, as it were. But I think it's something we really need to consider.
Okay, thank you so much, Fergal. Does anyone briefly want to respond to that? And Clean, I know you want to come in on the last topic as well. So I'll let Oisin respond to that, and then I'll let Cleena respond to the last topic, and then we'll wrap up.
If you want to let
Cleena, do you want to go first while Oisin comes out of his echo chamber?
Thanks, Sonia. I actually just wanted to respond to a question. It was a little way up. Somebody said they had, sorry, I can't remember your name. Someone said they had tried raising climate change with TDs canvassing during the elections, and they weren't interested, and basically started talking about fly tipping. It was the only thing they could talk about in relation to their environment. It was their comfort zone. And I suppose just to reflect on that, what Fergal said is right. Our elected representatives are a lot more aware of climate change than they ever were, and more and more of them are concerned about it, or at least will claim to be concerned about it. But do not assume that your elected representatives are well informed on the issue, because for the vast majority of cases they will not be. But in terms of interest and in terms of their information, their capacity, their analysis, their grasp of the issue, that's also where your work is so important. If they realize that people in their constituency care about the issue, they're going to go and get briefed about the issue. And that's then where our work starts to become mutually reinforcing. If you ignite them at the local level, then they're more likely to meet with us to go into greater detail on the nitty-gritty. They're more likely to come to our briefings. So then we're really supporting one another from top down, bottom up, and that's where we can really have some impact. And just to very quickly, finally, just to kind of, I suppose, finish on a positive note, certainly for me. Like I remember saying to Anya, who I met a number of years ago now, that what a difference it made when all the student activists came on board a number of years ago. What a difference it made to the climate movement. Then we had the likes of all these like new, really substantial, robust people coming in with this new angle analysis, like Sandra and her colleagues. And the issue is becoming broader and deeper in terms of the engagement from the bottom up and from these different kind of expert angles. And that's so heartening. The fact that we're on a call here, like with 90 people, is just incredible. So I think like this is a crisis, it is an opportunity. And in terms of a movement, we're in so much of a better position than we've ever been. Thanks.
Lost you, Anya.
You're muted, Anya.
Sorry, my computer keeps muting itself. I was just saying thank you so much to Cliona for that really lovely way of kind of rounding off what we were saying. I'm just going to hand over to Oisín to give a quick response to what Fergal said, and I'm just going to give a few practical pieces of information.
Yes, I'm sorry, I let Cliona go first now because I can't really follow that. But just one quick point on the previous question. I didn't say that that 43 of the now TDs signed the One Future pledge before the election. So that's committing themselves to the 9 demands remain. That's only 43 out of 160. It's a quarter. But actually, it includes 5 party leaders, including the leader of Sinn Féin, even though many of her own now TDs didn't sign. So that's again something we have to work with. The people who didn't sign, of course, are Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, as Fergal said. So I'll just comment briefly on that and on what we think we can say to TDs. Basically, I mean, as a citizen, not representing anybody, you can say whatever you like to politicians and to parties. As NGOs particularly, but as civil society organizations, we have to be really, really careful not to be in any way party political. So as I said in an answer to someone else much earlier on, my line for as long as I've been in this job has been, we need every party in every government to take climate change seriously for the next 20 years. But that's why we want the climate law to be really strong and to be really there, because we don't trust lots of parties to deliver on their promises or to make strong enough promises. And actually, one of the sort of, I'll make a couple of remarks now about the kind of overarching things to say to TDs, I think. But in terms of a concrete demand, there is an agreement from all parties that we need a new, stronger climate law. That was done in the last Parliament. We need that law passed in the first 100 days of a functioning Dáil in the post-COVID-19 crisis. It has to be a first 100 days thing. It has to lock in the government for its however long its term is to strong targets and to strong accountability. That will help us in every campaigning ask we make after that. But in terms of the asks we make more concretely, we were having this discussion earlier on. It's a bit hard to go in and say we need more bike lanes, as in the very specific demands kind of sound a bit odd now in the middle of this crisis. So those kinds of demands are in the One Future demand. They're higher level as well. They're there. We can give TDs those. We can give them the latest Stop Climate Case briefing. But I think in terms of a conversation with TDs and maybe an email action that we'll launch in the next week or so, if there's likely to be a government, it's three higher level things. Firstly, that we need to see the same determination from the new government to reduce emissions that we're seeing from the current outgoing government to reduce infections. Now, not the same intensity, hopefully we won't need daily briefings, but the same determination, the same leadership, the same coherence, the same joined upness from government, the same recognition that this is an existential threat. So we need that, first of all. And secondly, we need a framing, and we've talked about this, so I'll just summarize it again. I'll repeat what others have said. A framing that is a just recovery for people and planet, rather than just for polluters or profit or back to business as usual. So that we need to use the whole of the economic package. Somebody asked what percentage of the budget is it? It's the whole of the economic package, the whole of the budget, the whole of government program needs to have climate impact as one of its key metrics, reducing emissions as one of its key metrics. So that's the Green New Deal framing, but maybe now on just transition, maybe now just recovery. And lastly, which comes back to the top of the One Future demands, the sense of scale. So we have determination, we have the framing, and we have the scale. And the scale is Ireland needs to reduce its emissions by about 8% a year on average every year for the next 10 years to be on a path to achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement, as opposed to 2% a year, which is the outgoing government's commitment or outgoing government's plan, so that, you know, we need to be doing 4 times faster than we have been promising. So we need faster and fairer climate action. That was the slogan of the One Future campaign, and it remains just as relevant now in COVID-19 and post-COVID-19 as it did then. So there's the 3 things: determination, framing around a just recovery, and scale.
Thanks, Oisín. And Sive is just going to have one little closing statement.
Thanks, Sonia. No, I just wanted to come in to kind of follow up on what Oisín was saying there and emphasize the importance of talking to all parties. So when the Greens had 6 TDs in the last, well, in the election from 2007, wasn't it? And then they ended up in government, and subsequent to the crash lost all their seats. That created something of a vacuum for civil society in terms of who to talk to. The relationships weren't as strong with the other parties. It's very important that we build those relationships with all parties, and there's a lot to be learned from learning what the concerns of the likes of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael might be around climate change, and it's a very important conversation we need to have. And the second point I wanted to make is just around localizing a lot of this. We've talked about some of these things in a very abstract way or very national level, but for many of you it might make a lot of sense to campaign on issues that are very local. And one of the things you can do is ask your TDs to put down parliamentary questions about local issues that connect to climate change in some way. Look at air pollution, look at supporting the Solar Schools project. And just in terms of school and transport, because of the fact that they may well end up being closed until September, we don't know this for certain, there's an opportunity here for local authorities and local communities to redesign their traffic systems so that we can implement safe routes to school. We have a whole 4, 5, 6 months before September in which to do that. And that would make an enormous difference to the potential for school children and young people to walk and cycle safely to school. So we have to distill a lot of these kind of very big, grandiose objectives down into practical, tangible solutions that can be implemented. And that's just one example, physical distancing notwithstanding, that we might be able to work on during this crisis.
Super, thank you so much, everyone. We've run a little bit over time, but I think that really shows the engagement and the value and the depth of this discussion. I want to thank all the panelists, particularly Sandra, who just finished a really busy day in a hospital. So thank you so much to Sandra for coming on this. We really appreciate it. Just a few practical things. We are, and I know some of you are already engaged. My computer muted me again. Some of you are already engaged in local groups across the country, and I realize it's a slow process. I am coming back to you, but this moving off online to home has put a bit of a spanner in the works. But we will be coming back to you with resources and ways to contact your TD online in the next few days. And if you are not part of a group across the country, I'll send everyone an email with how to get involved in One Future groups. Then I will put you in a WhatsApp group with other people in your area so you can coordinate to meet your TDs together, or like I said, coordinate to redesign your entire transport sector in your community. And I just want to reiterate what Cliona said about this, like the real importance of working together, that connection of the top-down, bottom-up approach. When you talk to your TDs, it really means that the people who are working on the policy can get their messages across to them. So yeah, the work that everyone does is really important. And what you do is really what gives the power to all these people working on policy to help create the change. So we're all in it together. We will save the chat. Thank you all so much for coming on. And I'm going to play us a song out. Thanks so much for coming.
You got a friend in me. You got a friend in me. When the road looks rough ahead and you're miles and miles from your nice warm bed, you just remember what your old past said. Boy, you got a friend in me. Yeah, you got a friend in me.